Welcome to Narrative Nights. Step into a world of mystery, intrigue, and suspense. At Narrative Nights, we bring you thrilling detective stories that will challenge your mind and keep you guessing until the very end. Before we begin, we'd love to know, where in the world are you tuning in from? Drop a comment and let us know which part of the globe you're watching from. We're all united by the love of a good mystery. Let the investigation begin.
Miss Marple and the Devil's Shadows. Chapter 1. A Visitor in Distress. The morning sun fell softly upon the neat little garden of Miss Jane Marple's cottage in St. Mary Mead, glinting gently upon the lace curtains that framed her sitting-room window. Inside, the atmosphere was one of domestic tranquility, the soft ticking of a clock, the faint aroma of freshly baked scones, and the subdued clink of teacups. Miss Marple, with her needles clicking steadily, sat opposite her old friend, Mrs. Margaret Bantry, who was immersed in cheerful village chatter. "My dear Jane," Mrs. Bantry remarked as she refilled her companion's cup, "one must admit that village life grows most predictable. The most dramatic occurrence this week was poor Mrs. Potts resigning from the flower committee in a fit of pique over carnations, of all things. Quite scandalous." Miss Marple's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "I have often found, Margaret, that the quietest days, those filled with seemingly trivial quarrels, are the very ones that precede the most startling events." As if on cue, there came a hesitant knock at the door. Edith, Miss Marple's devoted housekeeper, entered with a flustered expression. "Beg pardon, she said, twisting her apron. "There's a young gentleman at the gate. He looks most agitated and insists upon seeing you at once." "Good gracious!" exclaimed Mrs. Bantry, setting down her teacup with interest. "Whoever can it be?" "Please show him in, Edith," said Miss Marple quietly, laying aside her knitting with deliberate care. Moments later, a pale, travel-worn young man appeared in the doorway. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes strained, and his hands twisted his hat nervously. He hovered as though uncertain of his welcome. "Do sit down, young man," Miss Marple said kindly, indicating a comfortable chair by the fire. "You look quite shaken. Would you care for a glass of water?" "Thank you," he murmured hoarsely. After drinking, he seemed steadier. "Forgive my intrusion, Miss Marple. I have nowhere else to turn. If you have any compassion at all, please help me." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly, her eyes alight with curiosity. "Of course," Miss Marple replied gently, her gaze keen beneath its softness. "Tell me everything from the beginning." The young man drew a deep breath. "My name is Daniel Thornton. My sister, Eleanor, as we called her, died last month. The police ruled it a suicide. But it is impossible. She would never have taken her own life. I knew her, Miss Marple. She loved life too well." Miss Marple inclined her head gravely. "Go on, Daniel." "I am listening." "It was her husband, Richard Reed." "A police officer himself," Daniel continued bitterly. "They closed the case at once. No questions, no doubts. He declared it suicide, and that was enough for them. I even hired a detective, but he parroted the same story. Yet I cannot accept it. My sister had burns on her hands, strange marks. She was afraid. I could feel it." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind worked quickly behind them. "Why do you suspect foul play, beyond your instincts?" Daniel's voice trembled with suppressed fury. "Because Richard, he was eager to marry another. A woman named Olivia Harries. She returned to the village just before Eleanor died. It cannot be coincidence." Mrs. Bantry uttered a scandalized "Oh," while Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "You believe your brother-in-law had reason to be rid of her, then? And you say the police accepted his word without hesitation?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "They all shielded him. He has influence. But I cannot rest until the truth is known. Miss Marple, you are my last hope." There was a long pause. Miss Marple studied his drawn, earnest face. She recognized in him the genuine grief of a man who had lost someone dear, mingled with the righteous desperation of one determined to uncover the truth. "You have done right to come," she said at last, her voice firm but kind. "The authorities may indeed be compromised. If there is even the faintest chance that your sister's death was not what it seemed, the matter must be looked into. I shall accompany you to Little Hampton without delay." Daniel's weary eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Marple. You cannot know what this means to me." After he had taken his leave, Mrs. Bantry turned anxiously to her friend. "Jane, do be careful. There is something very dark in that young man's story. It gives me a chill." "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly, rising to pack her small case. "It gives me a chill as well. Darkness thrives in silence, Margaret. And it is precisely in such silence that one must be most alert." Her mind, though outwardly serene, was already racing ahead. A supposed suicide in a respectable household, a husband too eager to declare the matter settled, a young brother who refused to accept the official version, these were threads of a tapestry she had seen before. And often enough, they revealed secrets far uglier than appearances allowed. By the following morning, Miss Marple and Daniel were aboard the little train that would take them to Little Hampton. Miss Marple settled comfortably by the window, her shawl folded neatly on her lap, while the young man sat opposite, his fingers drumming nervously upon his knee. "Why don't you tell me about your sister?" Miss Marple suggested kindly. "It would help to know what sort of person she was." Daniel's expression softened. "Elena was the sensible one. After our parents died, she raised me almost single-handedly. She was capable, strong-willed, and hopeful. Not the sort to give up easily. And her marriage? At first it seemed happy enough. Richard was respectable, reliable, even. But soon Elena grew quieter, more withdrawn. She stopped visiting me. When she did, she looked anxious. Eventually, she hardly spoke of her home life at all." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she knitted, her eyes fixed on him. "And you suspect she was mistreated?" "Yes, though she never said it outright. There were signs, the burns on her hands, her strained smiles. And Richard, with his police connections, was untouchable. She was isolated." Miss Marple listened, her sharp mind already assembling the puzzle. Abuse, isolation, jealousy, and a rekindled romance, all ingredients of tragedy. And yet, there was something more. Something subtler, darker, that tugged at the edges of her intuition. "And this other woman, Olivia Harries?" she asked gently. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Richard's childhood friend. She always adored him. She disappeared for years, but returned just before Eleanor's death. Eleanor never spoke of her, but I could tell she was uneasy. I believe she suspected Richard had rekindled their acquaintance." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her knitting needles flashing in the lamplight. Curious timing indeed. The train clattered steadily on, carrying them towards a quiet village that would soon surrender its secrets. Daniel stared out of the window, lost in his grief, while Miss Marple knitted calmly, her mind turning over every clue, every detail, and every shadow hinted at in his words. For she knew, as she always did, that beneath the polished surface of respectable lives lay darkness waiting to be uncovered. And Miss Jane Marple, quiet, unassuming, but with eyes that missed nothing, was ready to uncover it. Chapter 2: Shadows in Little Hampton. The train gave a final, exhausted whistle as it drew into the sleepy station of Little Hampton. The air was fresher here, touched with the faint perfume of meadows and the distant cry of rooks. Daniel leapt down onto the platform first, offering his hand to Miss Marple, who accepted it with the quiet dignity of one accustomed to managing herself perfectly well, but too polite to refuse. "It hasn't changed much," Miss Marple remarked, her eyes taking in the small booking office, the faded posters curling at the edges, and the sleepy porter wheeling a barrow of parcels. "Villages rarely do, you know. They keep their secrets tucked into the same corners year after year." Daniel, anxious and restless, scarcely heard her. "It's only a short walk to my brother-in-law's house. We'll pass the green, the church, and then," his words faltered, as if the mere mention of Richard Reed's name soured the air. Miss Marple nodded and fell into step beside him, her pace unhurried, her eyes everywhere at once. She noted the way the villagers looked up as they passed, curiosity flickering quickly into something more guarded. A pair of women halted their gossip mid-sentence, an old man tugged at his cap and turned away. "Odd," murmured Miss Marple softly. "When a community goes so silent at the sight of strangers, it usually means there is something they do not wish to have spoken aloud." They reached the house sooner than Daniel expected, a handsome, red-brick building, its windows polished, its garden neat to the point of severity. The brass plate by the door gleamed, "Inspector Richard Reed." Daniel clenched his fists. "This is it. He'll pretend civility, but don't believe a word of it." Before Miss Marple could reply, the door opened. Richard Reed stood framed in the doorway, a tall man with an air of authority, his police uniform lending weight to his presence. His face was handsome in a severe way, but his eyes, sharp, assessing, were those of a man used to command. "Daniel," he said coldly, "you should have written before bringing visitors." His gaze slid to Miss Marple, polite but wary. "I thought it better to come directly," Daniel retorted. "This is Miss Marple. She's agreed to look into Eleanor's death." For the briefest instant, Richard's composure cracked, then he smiled, a hard, unconvincing smile. "I see. Well, you are welcome, of course. Though I assure you, Miss Marple, the matter has already been thoroughly examined. My late wife, God rest her, took her own life. It was tragic, yes, but not suspicious." Miss Marple regarded him with mild blue eyes, knitting needles already at work in her bag though she had not yet sat down. "How fortunate," she said softly, "to be so certain about such things. Most of us muddle about for quite some time before settling upon conclusions." Richard stiffened but said no more, stepping aside to let them enter. The house was immaculate, almost oppressively so. Flowers stood in vases without a single drooping petal, the carpets were spotless, and even the air smelled faintly of polish. But Miss Marple, with her sharp village-trained eyes, noted the absence of something. There were no photographs of Eleanor. Not on the mantel, not in the hall, not even tucked discreetly on a side table. "Tell me," she said conversationally as they were shown into the drawing-room, "did your wife enjoy gardening? I've often found one can learn much about a household by its roses." "She had no time for such things," Richard replied curtly. "Her health was delicate." Daniel's mouth opened in protest, but Miss Marple silenced him with the slightest motion of her hand. Her gaze had already shifted to the window, where she noticed a figure crossing the garden path, a woman of striking beauty, her dark hair pinned with careless elegance, her walk graceful yet self-assured. She carried a basket of letters and entered without knocking, as though the house were her own. "Ah," said Richard, his face relaxing into something almost warm. "Miss Harries. Olivia, allow me to present Miss Marple and my brother-in-law." Olivia Harries inclined her head with a cool smile. Her eyes were brilliant, but they lingered a fraction too long on Richard's face, and the familiarity between them was unmistakable. Miss Marple, though outwardly all gentle courtesy, tucked the detail neatly into her mind. In villages, she knew, the heart spoke loudest through glances. "I must apologize," Olivia said smoothly. "I come often to assist Mr. Reed with correspondence. It is difficult for him, after such a loss." Daniel muttered under his breath, but Miss Marple pretended not to hear. Instead, she leaned forward with apparent mildness. "My dear, how kind of you. Though one wonders, did you also assist the late Mrs. Reed?" For the first time, Olivia's composure faltered. She flushed, then recovered herself with a laugh. "No, I hardly knew her. I was abroad for many years." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "How curious, then, that you returned just before her sad passing. One might almost call it providential timing." There was a silence. Richard's face hardened, Olivia looked away, and Daniel seized the moment. "You see, Miss Marple? You see how it is." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, twice. She looked around the perfect, sterile room, at the absence of Eleanor's presence, at the tension between the living, and she knew with absolute certainty something dreadful lay beneath the surface here. And she would uncover it. Chapter 3: The First Clues. The next morning, as the sun rose over Little Hampton, it cast a soft golden light over the village, making the cobblestones gleam as though they had just been washed. The streets were quiet, with only a few early risers stirring as Miss Marple made her way through the village. She had spent the night carefully reviewing her observations, and the event of the previous day left her with a growing sense of unease. It was during her walk to the village square that she first noticed how carefully the villagers avoided looking her in the eye. There was something in their expressions, hastily averted glances, muttered greetings, that made it clear that the town held its secrets close. And though they spoke politely, Miss Marple could sense the undercurrent of tension beneath their words. She approached the post office, where the village gossip often found its first ears, and was greeted by Mrs. Harris, a stout, cheerful woman with a loud voice. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Lovely day, isn't it?" Mrs. Harris said, as she swept open the door to the post office. "How are you finding Little Hampton?" Miss Marple smiled warmly, her mind already at work. "Charming, as always. I'm simply here to take a quick walk and perhaps gather a few details, Mrs. Harris. I'm sure the village has plenty of interesting stories to share." Mrs. Harris chuckled, nodding. "Ah, stories. That's something we have in abundance, Miss Marple. You'd be amazed what goes on behind closed doors in this village. Take Richard Reed's house, for example." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward, her curiosity piqued. "Oh? What sort of stories, Mrs. Harris?" The older woman lowered her voice, glancing around, though the post office was empty save for the two of them. "Oh, you know, strange things have been happening there lately. The smoke, the late-night visitors. And, well, people are beginning to talk about the odd nature of Olivia Harries' return to the village." "Really?" Miss Marple's voice was calm, but her mind was already alert. "And what do they say about Olivia?" Mrs. Harris raised an eyebrow, her voice dropping even lower. "They say she's more than just a friend of Richard's. Some folk in the village are whispering about how close they were before Elena's death, and how she conveniently turned up just before it. Some even think she had something to do with it. But, of course, it's just gossip. I couldn't say for sure. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Gossip is a strange thing, isn't it? How it seems to have legs of its own and runs faster than the truth. But it can be useful all the same. Mrs. Harris smiled knowingly, clearly pleased with the turn of the conversation. I do believe that, Miss Marple. Now, you must take care. Not all of the village is quite as friendly as it seems. People like Richard Reed have a way of making things go unnoticed. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped outside, her thoughts turning over the information she had just gathered. The whispers about Olivia's timely return and her closeness to Richard Reed could not be ignored. But there was still something else, something deeper and darker, that Miss Marple couldn't yet put her finger on. After leaving the post office, Miss Marple took a leisurely stroll toward the village green, where she had been told several of the older villagers liked to gather. As she passed the church, the familiar smell of incense and old wood filled the air. She paused for a moment, contemplating Father Gabriel and his involvement in the mystery. She was not one to believe in coincidences, and Father Gabriel's presence in the village was becoming increasingly suspicious. If his connections with Richard Reed and Olivia Harris were as significant as the whispers suggested, then he had a hand in something far darker than mere spiritual guidance. But there was one other source of information Miss Marple needed to visit before she could make any final judgments: the neighbors. Miss Marple was greeted by Mrs. Wallace, an elderly woman who lived 2 doors down from the Reed household. Mrs. Wallace was sitting on her front porch, knitting, as she always did in the mornings. Her sharp eyes followed Miss Marple's every movement, but she gave no indication of suspicion. "Good morning, Mrs. Wallace," Miss Marple said politely, taking a seat beside her. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Mrs. Wallace chuckled softly, adjusting her glasses. "Not at all, Miss Marple. Always a pleasure to have company. What brings you to my porch this fine morning?" "I'm just taking a quiet walk through the village, you know. And I thought I might ask you a few questions about the Reed household. I'm sure you've seen quite a lot in your time living here." Mrs. Wallace paused, her knitting needle stilling for a moment. Then she glanced down the street toward the Reed house, her face tightening slightly. "What a family, Miss Marple. I'll tell you this, Richard and his wife never seemed quite right. Always a tension in that house, even before poor Elena's death. And then there was the matter of the strange smoke coming from their chimney at odd hours, and then Olivia's return just before the tragedy. It's all a bit too convenient, don't you think?" Miss Marple nodded, her eyes sharp. "And did you ever see anything unusual, Mrs. Wallace? Anything that might explain the way things ended for poor Elena?" Mrs. Wallace hesitated for a long moment, then lowered her voice. "Well, there was the priest. Father Gabriel, I believe. He visited that house often, and Elena was always uneasy whenever he was around. But she never spoke of him directly. I think she was afraid of him. I remember her eyes. There was a fear in them when she looked at him. Not the fear of a sick person needing comfort, but a fear of something much darker." Miss Marple's brow furrowed slightly, the pieces of the puzzle slowly starting to come together. "And did you ever see anything suspicious, Mrs. Wallace? Any odd visitors or strange events?" Mrs. Wallace's eyes darted toward the Reed house once more. "Well, there's been talk of Father Gabriel holding strange rituals at the house. Nothing too obvious, mind you, but odd things that don't sit right. I've heard him speaking to the villagers, promising spiritual comfort, but some say it was just a cover for something else." Miss Marple rose slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Thank you, Mrs. Wallace. Your insights are invaluable. As Miss Marple walked back toward her hotel, her mind was racing. The evidence was starting to accumulate, and while she had learned much, there were still pieces missing. Father Gabriel was a key player in this mystery, but what had really happened to Elena Reed? Was her death truly a suicide, or had something much darker taken place beneath the surface? Miss Marple knew that she had only scratched the surface. But the truth was there, hidden just below the facade of village life. And she would uncover it, no matter how deeply it was buried. Chapter 4: The Unraveling Truth. The following day, as the village of Little Hampton woke beneath a sky clouded with unease, Miss Marple was already in motion. Her morning had been spent with careful deliberation, drawing together all the details she had gathered so far. The investigation was beginning to reveal a troubling pattern, a pattern of secrecy, manipulation, and deceit that ran deeper than anyone in this small, picturesque village might have imagined. After breakfast, Miss Marple took a steady walk toward the Reed household. The house stood at the end of a quiet lane, where the well-kept garden gave no hint of the sinister events that had unfolded within. As she approached, she noted the stillness of the air and the absence of sound, save for the distant chirp of birds and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Daniel Thornton, ever restless and anxious, joined her at the gate. His face was drawn, his eyes sunken from sleepless nights, and there was a clear tension in his stance. "Are you sure you want to do this, Miss Marple?" Daniel asked, his voice low, almost pleading. "My family has already suffered enough. Richard, he doesn't know the truth. He thinks we're just here to make a scene." Miss Marple smiled gently, placing a hand on his arm. "My dear Daniel, if the truth is to be found, it cannot remain hidden, no matter how much people wish to avoid it. Richard Reed may not understand, but we must continue. The truth has a way of finding its voice, even when it's buried beneath layers of silence." Daniel nodded, though there was little conviction in his gesture. He had already spoken with Miss Marple many times about his brother-in-law's quiet resistance to the truth. Richard had been adamant that Elena's death was a suicide. Yet Miss Marple's suspicions had only deepened with each new piece of the puzzle. There was more at play here than a simple tragedy, and she could feel the weight of it in the air as she stepped forward. The door to the Reed household creaked as Miss Marple knocked gently, a sound that seemed far louder than it should have been in the stillness of the village. Moments later, Martha Reed, Richard's mother, appeared at the threshold. Her eyes were tired, though she tried to greet them with a faint, strained smile. "Miss Marple, Daniel," she said in a subdued tone, stepping aside to allow them entry. "What brings you here today?" "We are here to speak with Richard," Miss Marple replied calmly, her voice soft but firm. "I believe there are some matters that still need to be addressed regarding Elena's death." Martha's expression faltered slightly, and she glanced toward the staircase, as if seeking confirmation from someone unseen. With a hesitant nod, she led them into the dimly lit drawing room, where Richard sat, his back stiff as a board. He looked every inch the respected officer, tall, imposing, with an air of authority that seemed impenetrable. Miss Marple had always prided herself on her ability to read a room, and Richard's was no exception. The moment he met her gaze, his expression shifted, just the slightest flicker of discomfort before it returned to its usual stone-faced composure. "Miss Marple, Daniel," Richard greeted them stiffly, rising from his chair. "What is this about?" "I have already explained everything regarding Elena's death. It was a suicide, as the police concluded." Miss Marple, never one to shy away from the difficult truths, took a seat opposite Richard, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Officer Reed, the conclusions of the police are not enough. There are details that don't add up, and I believe you may be overlooking something important." Daniel, his voice shaking, added bitterly, "You're the one who didn't look close enough, Richard." Elena was not the type to give up. You know that. She didn't take her own life. But you've closed your eyes to the truth. Richard's eyes hardened at the accusation. Richard froze, his eyes narrowing. For the first time, Miss Marple saw a flicker of something, perhaps guilt, perhaps fear, pass across his face. "We're not here to accuse you, Richard," Miss Marple said gently, her voice steady. "But we need you to open up. If you truly loved Elena, you'll help us find out what happened to her." Richard's gaze wavered. For a long moment, he said nothing. The tension in the room was palpable, and Daniel, watching his brother-in-law, could sense the impending collapse. Finally, Richard sighed deeply, lowering his shoulders in resignation. "I didn't want this. I didn't want her to die." But Elena didn't understand. She didn't know the pressure I was under. And Olivia, she was always there, always close. I couldn't escape her. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. So it was Olivia. She had a hand in this. Richard's voice faltered. "I don't know. But I was too weak to stop it. Father Gabriel, he helped me, guided me when everything felt out of control. But I never thought it would lead to this." The room fell silent, save for the soft ticking of a clock on the mantel. Miss Marple absorbed his words carefully, piecing together the fragments of the story Richard had revealed. She could see the cracks in his story, the guilt, the desperation, the manipulation, but the truth was still slipping through her fingers. "Richard," she said softly, "this isn't over. There are still things we need to uncover. You're not the only one who has been deceived here. We'll get to the bottom of it, no matter where it leads." As she stood to leave, she turned to Daniel, who was watching with a mix of confusion and anger. He had known his brother-in-law was hiding something, but this was more than he had expected. "Let's go, Daniel," she said quietly. "The truth is closer now, but we must remain cautious. There's still much more to uncover." With that, Miss Marple and Daniel left the Reed household behind, but the truth was no closer to being revealed. As Miss Marple stepped out into the quiet street, she knew the next move was just as crucial. The game had only just begun, and the pieces were slowly falling into place. The shadows of deception were long, but Miss Marple was patient, and the truth, she knew, would soon be brought to light. Chapter 5: The Devil's Handiwork. Little Hampton's tranquility, however deceptive, seemed to draw closer to its breaking point with each passing hour. The village, veiled in morning fog and uncertainty, whispered of darker deeds and hidden truths. Miss Marple had never been one to rush into conclusions, but the time for subtlety was growing short. That morning, after a brief but purposeful breakfast at her small hotel, Miss Marple took the opportunity to review her notes. They were detailed, filled with observations and conversations, fragments of truths pieced together from family secrets, neighbors' gossip, and personal insights that only someone like her could uncover. The unsettling feeling in the pit of her stomach told her she was on the right track, but she could feel the sharp edge of danger growing closer. Miss Marple sat in her chair by the window, knitting needles clicking gently in rhythm, her mind turning over the details like a well-worn puzzle. The case was complicated, and the people involved had each played their parts in the intricate web of deceit that she was now slowly unraveling. But there were still so many questions. The truth, she knew, was much darker than anyone had imagined. Later in the day, Daniel arrived at the hotel, his face drawn and pale, but his eyes sharp with determination. Miss Marple had not expected him to call on her so soon. His concerns were clear from the start. "I can't stay idle, Miss Marple. Richard's involvement with Olivia, it all feels so wrong," he said, his voice shaking slightly with frustration. "We need to do something. I need answers." Miss Marple studied him carefully, noting his anxious demeanor. She had seen this kind of desperation before, people clinging to their last hope. But she had also seen how such urgency could cloud one's judgment. She knew Daniel needed a sense of closure, and though she couldn't promise him that, she could offer him the clarity that only time and patience could bring. "Patience, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, laying down her knitting. "The truth is like a tree, it grows, slowly but surely. We mustn't rush. Every piece we uncover brings us closer." Daniel looked unconvinced, but he nodded. There was little else he could do. "What are we doing next?" Miss Marple stood, smoothing her skirt. "We need to visit Father Gabriel once more. There's still something about him, something I haven't fully grasped. His connection to this family, to Elena's death, is not coincidental. We need to confront him. I suspect he has more to hide than we can see." The two of them set out for the church, the morning mist still hanging in the air like a shroud. The streets of Little Hampton were quieter than usual, as if the entire village was holding its breath. The fog twisted around them, and Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, as always, piecing together the fragments of a story that had yet to be fully told. Arriving at the church, Miss Marple and Daniel were greeted by the familiar, unsettling atmosphere. The building loomed ahead, its stone walls draped in ivy, the narrow windows darkened by the fog. The village church, so often a symbol of peace, now felt like a looming fortress of secrets. Father Gabriel was inside, just as Miss Marple had suspected. He stood near the altar, his back to them as he arranged hymn books, just as he had done the previous day. He turned slowly when he heard them approach, his calm, unreadable expression falling into place. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth and controlled. "What brings you here again?" Miss Marple's eyes were steady, her posture composed. "Father Gabriel, I believe you know why we're here." Father Gabriel's smile flickered briefly, a subtle tension in his jaw. "I'm afraid I don't, Miss Marple. I've already told you everything I know about Elena's death." Miss Marple approached slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "You've told us your version, but there's more you haven't shared. We know you've been involved in much more than you've admitted." Daniel stepped forward, his frustration evident. "You're hiding something, Father. We know it. We've seen the signs." Father Gabriel's calmness faltered only slightly, but his gaze hardened. "I don't know what you're implying, but I've been nothing but helpful. I offered counsel to Elena when she needed it. I've done nothing wrong." Miss Marple's voice remained soft, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "You see, Father, that's where you're wrong. It's not just your words that are troubling, it's your actions. You have a pattern of manipulating those who seek comfort from you. And I believe Elena was one of your victims." Father Gabriel's eyes narrowed, his expression turning colder. "You're mistaken, Miss Marple. Elena sought my guidance. There's nothing more to it." "But there is more, Father," Miss Marple continued, her voice unwavering. "Elena was not the only one who came to you. Your influence over her, over Richard Reed, and over Olivia Hargreaves, is deeper than you realize. Your methods, these rituals, these symbols, are not for comfort, but for control. You used Elena's vulnerability to push her towards despair." Father Gabriel's face was now pale, his lips pressed together in a thin line. "You know nothing about it. You've no proof." "Actually," Miss Marple said, "we have proof. We found the objects Elena had hidden, dried herbs, symbols of protection, and a silver locket identical to the ones worn by your parishioners. Father Gabriel's composure finally cracked, just for a moment. His eyes flickered, his breath shallow. He opened his mouth as if to speak but closed it again, visibly restraining himself. "Don't pretend you don't understand, Father," Miss Marple said. "You've been hiding behind your role as a spiritual leader, but you've used that position for far darker purposes. You manipulated Elena's fears and drove her to her death." Father Gabriel's shoulders slumped, his head bowed in defeat. "I only wanted to help. I thought I could save her. But she was beyond saving. She refused to listen to me." Miss Marple's expression softened slightly, though there was no pity in her eyes. "You used her, Father. You used her for your own ends, and now you will answer for it." The room grew still as Father Gabriel's silence stretched. At last, he spoke, his voice low and resigned. "You may think you've won, Miss Marple, but you don't understand. There are forces at work here that go beyond the reach of simple justice." Miss Marple stood tall, her resolve unwavering. "Perhaps so, Father. But no matter how deep the darkness, the truth will always find its way to the surface." Chapter 6: The Devil's Handiwork. The fog that had shrouded Little Hampton in the early hours of the morning began to lift as the day wore on, but the weight of the mystery that enveloped the village lingered, thick as ever. The events of the last few days had cast a long shadow over the quiet streets, and now, as Miss Marple and Daniel made their way back from the church, the reality of the situation began to settle in. Father Gabriel's confession, though not complete, had given them a glimpse of the darkness that had been lurking beneath the surface for so long. The priest, whose calm exterior had once shielded his manipulative nature, now seemed to be unraveling before their eyes. But there were still so many unanswered questions, so many pieces of the puzzle that had yet to fall into place. "We're close, Daniel," Miss Marple said quietly as they walked down the path leading from the church. "Very close." Daniel, his face pale with frustration and disbelief, nodded. "But we need more proof. We can't just rely on what Father Gabriel said. There has to be something more, something that will make the truth undeniable." Miss Marple turned to him, her eyes sharp with determination. "Indeed, we need solid evidence. But sometimes the truth is buried so deeply that it takes a careful eye to uncover it. We must continue our investigation, even if it means digging deeper into places we may not want to go." They continued their walk through the village, heading toward Elena's home. As they passed by the modest cottages and well-kept gardens, Miss Marple couldn't help but reflect on the quiet lives of the people here. Little Hampton, with its idyllic charm, seemed an unlikely setting for the tragedy that had unfolded within its midst. Yet, as always, appearances could be deceiving. "Miss Marple, do you think Father Gabriel is responsible for everything?" Daniel asked, his voice tinged with doubt. "Could he really have orchestrated Elena's death?" Miss Marple paused, considering the question carefully. "I believe he had a hand in it, yes. But there is more to this story. Father Gabriel may have manipulated Elena, but the death of a young woman, especially one as full of life as Elena, cannot be the result of just one man's influence. There are others involved, and it's those others we need to uncover." Daniel looked at her, his eyes filled with both fear and hope. "Who do you think they are? Who else could be hiding something?" Miss Marple's gaze hardened slightly as she looked toward the house that had once been Elena's home. "That is what we must discover, my dear. But we must proceed carefully. The closer we get to the truth, the more dangerous it becomes." As they reached the doorstep of Elena's house, Miss Marple paused, her eyes scanning the building. The house, though small, had an air of neglect about it. The garden was overgrown, the windows dark, as if the life that once filled it had been drained away. It was the perfect setting for a mystery, and Miss Marple knew that the answers they sought lay within. Daniel hesitated. "Are you sure we should go in? What if someone's inside?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "There's no harm in checking, Daniel. If there's something to be found, we will find it." With that, they entered the house. The air inside was cool and stale, the silence almost oppressive. Miss Marple's sharp eyes took in every detail, the worn furniture, the faint smell of dampness, the neglected corners that spoke of a house once full of life but now abandoned by the light of joy. "I'll start upstairs," Miss Marple said, her voice low but steady. "You stay down here and check the ground floor. We'll meet in a few minutes." Daniel nodded, though his eyes betrayed his unease. As Miss Marple ascended the stairs, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the past pressing down on her. Elena's life had been full of promise, yet it had been snuffed out in a cruel and manipulative way. The pieces of the puzzle were there, but they had yet to be fully revealed. The room where Elena had died was still as it had been, the furniture arranged as it had been in life, yet there was an unmistakable air of sadness, of tragedy, that lingered in the space. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she examined the room, her sharp gaze scanning every corner for something, anything, that might provide a clue. She walked over to the window, peering out into the garden below. There was nothing unusual there, just the same overgrown plants and neglected flowers. But then, her eyes caught something. A small, inconspicuous object had been left on the windowsill, half hidden by the drapes. Miss Marple reached for it, her fingers brushing the delicate surface of a silver locket. It was identical to the one Olivia Hargreaves had worn, and it sent a chill down her spine. She turned it over, her eye scanning the engraving on the back. The symbols were familiar, and they confirmed what she had suspected all along. Father Gabriel's influence extended beyond Elena. He had been working to manipulate everyone involved in this tragedy. A creak behind her made her turn quickly. Daniel stood in the doorway, his face pale. "Miss Marple, you need to see this." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What have you found?" Daniel hesitated, then stepped forward, his hand shaking as he held up a bundle of letters. They were hidden in the floorboards. "It looks like they were written by Elena." Miss Marple took the letters from him, her heart sinking as she read the first few lines. They were desperate, filled with fear and confusion. Elena had been reaching out for help, but it was too late. She had been trapped in a web of manipulation, with no one to turn to. Chapter 7: Confrontation at Sunday Service. The quiet streets of Little Hampton were bathed in the soft golden light of early Sunday morning. The tranquility of the village was deceptive. Beneath the peaceful exterior, tension simmered like a storm waiting to break. Miss Marple had spent the previous night reflecting on the evidence they had uncovered, and she knew that today would be the day they would confront the dark forces that had been lurking in the village for so long. As the clock in the village church tower struck 10, the congregation began to gather. The sound of footsteps echoed through the cobblestone streets as the villagers made their way to the small stone church at the center of the village. There was an air of expectancy in the air, but Miss Marple could sense something deeper, something unsettling. The villagers, many of whom had been friends for years, were unaware of the storm that was about to unfold within the walls of their beloved church. Miss Marple, accompanied by Daniel and Reverend Thomas, made her way through the village toward the church. Daniel, though resolute, was clearly nervous. His usual confidence had been shaken by the revelations of the past few days. Miss Marple, however, was calm and collected. She had seen much darker things in her time, and nothing about this situation unnerved her. They reached the church, and as they stepped inside, Miss Marple couldn't help but notice the quiet reverence of the congregation. The pews were filled with villagers, their heads bowed in prayer, unaware of the confrontation that was about to take place. Father Gabriel stood at the front, his tall, imposing figure exuding an air of authority. His eyes were focused on the pulpit, and his voice resonated through the church as he began the sermon. His words, laced with false sincerity, spoke of forgiveness, redemption, and the healing power of faith. The villagers listened intently, hanging on his every word. But Miss Marple saw through the facade. She could sense the manipulation in his tone, the way he twisted words to suit his own agenda. The man was a master of control, using his position of authority to cloud the minds of those who trusted him. As Father Gabriel continued his sermon, Miss Marple exchanged a quiet glance with Daniel. This was the moment. The truth had to be revealed, and Father Gabriel had to be exposed for the manipulator he was. At the perfect moment, Miss Marple stood up, her presence commanding the attention of the entire congregation. The murmurs that rippled through the church were drowned out by the sound of her voice, steady and clear, as she addressed the priest. "Father Gabriel," she began, her voice echoing through the church, "perhaps forgiveness should begin with the truth." The congregation fell silent, all eyes turning to Miss Marple as she took a few steps toward the pulpit. Father Gabriel's expression faltered for a brief moment before he regained his composure. His eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a thin smile. "I beg your pardon, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but laced with an underlying tension. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean." Miss Marple stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "I have discovered troubling truths about Elena Reed's death, truths that implicate you," she continued, her voice calm but firm. "You have been manipulating those around you, using your position to control and exploit. Elena's death was not a suicide, as you would have everyone believe. It was orchestrated, and you were the one pulling the strings." A gasp rippled through the congregation, and Father Gabriel's face paled slightly. His smile faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "This is preposterous," he said, his voice tinged with anger. "Elena's death was a tragic accident. I had nothing to do with it." Daniel, unable to hold back any longer, stepped forward, his voice shaking with emotion. "You're lying, Father. You manipulated Elena, drove her to despair. You used your so-called spiritual guidance to control her, and now you're trying to cover up what you did." Father Gabriel's eyes flickered with annoyance, but he maintained his calm exterior. "You know nothing of what you're talking about, Mr. Thornton," he said, his voice icy. "I did what I could to help your sister, and now you're trying to tarnish my reputation with these baseless accusations." Miss Marple held up a hand, silencing the exchange. "We have evidence, Father Gabriel. We found Elena's letters, written in fear of you. We found the ritual objects she was encouraged to use. And we know about your past in Cornwall, where similar incidents occurred. You may have escaped once, but you will not escape the truth now." The priest's face darkened, and for the first time, his calm facade cracked. His hands clenched at his sides, and his eyes narrowed dangerously. "You have no idea what you're meddling with, Miss Marple," he hissed. "This is bigger than you or anyone else here. You don't understand the forces at play." Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, unflinching. "I understand more than you think, Father," she replied softly. "You have been using fear and manipulation to control those around you, hiding behind your role as a spiritual guide. But I see through your facade, and so does the truth." The tension in the church was palpable. The villagers, who had once trusted Father Gabriel, now looked at him with suspicion. Some even began to whisper among themselves, doubt creeping into their minds. Father Gabriel's eyes darted nervously around the room, and for a brief moment, his composure wavered. But then, with a forced smile, he turned to the congregation. "I've had enough of these ridiculous accusations," he said, his voice cold. "I will not stand here and be insulted in front of my own parishioners. If you wish to believe these lies, then so be it." With that, he turned on his heel and strode out of the church, his footsteps echoing through the silence that followed. The villagers were left in stunned silence, the weight of the revelation settling over them. Miss Marple stood there for a moment, her heart heavy with the knowledge of the truth they had uncovered. But she felt no triumph, no satisfaction. Justice had been served, but at a cost. She glanced at Daniel, who stood beside her, his face a mixture of relief and sorrow. "We have done what we can, Daniel," Miss Marple said softly, her voice gentle but resolute. "The truth is out. Now it is up to the authorities to take the next step." Daniel nodded, though his expression remained somber. "I never imagined things would unfold this way. But at least now, Elena's death won't be in vain." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Indeed. And perhaps, in time, the village will heal from the wounds that have been inflicted upon it." As the congregation slowly began to disperse, Miss Marple and Daniel made their way to the back of the church, where Reverend Thomas was waiting for them. "I think it's over," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. "Father Gabriel's grip on this village has been broken. The truth has come to light, and the darkness is finally lifting." Reverend Thomas nodded, his expression grave. "I only hope the damage he's caused can be undone in time. But for now, at least there is some measure of peace." Miss Marple glanced out the church window, her eyes thoughtful. "Yes, Reverend. Peace. But it is a fragile thing, one that must be nurtured and protected. And for now, we must return to St. Mary Mead and prepare ourselves for whatever may come next." Chapter 8. Justice Served. The final chapter of the little mystery in Little Hampton had unfolded. Father Gabriel's manipulations had been exposed, and the villagers, once blinded by trust, now stood with a heavy heart as the truth spread throughout their homes. The priest had been escorted away, his reign of subtle control shattered. The villagers murmured their disbelief, some outraged, others ashamed, but all were forever changed. Miss Marple, however, felt no satisfaction from the revelation of guilt. She did not feel triumph or the heady rush of victory, her emotions were more complicated. Justice, she knew, was not always the clean-cut resolution people imagined. There was often collateral damage, and sometimes the truth only led to more questions, not answers. As she sat in the modest hotel room, Miss Marple gazed out the window, watching the quiet streets of Little Hampton. The soft hum of village life had returned, but there was a weight in the air, a heaviness that had not been there before. The sunshine outside was still, as if trying to provide some semblance of comfort after the storm that had passed through. Daniel Thornton had come to see her one last time. Though grief still clouded his features, there was a flicker of relief in his eyes. Elena's truth had been uncovered. She would not be forgotten. "Miss Marple," Daniel said, his voice low but filled with gratitude as he took a seat opposite her. "I wanted to thank you properly. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in. You've given my sister justice, and that means more to me than words can say." Miss Marple offered him a gentle smile. "Justice is its own reward, Daniel," she replied softly. "But it's good to know that Elena's death wasn't in vain. That her voice, even in silence, has been heard." Daniel nodded, but there was a sadness that lingered in his eyes. "I suppose now the village can go back to being what it was before. But I'll never be the same." Miss Marple paused, her gaze thoughtful. "None of us are, Daniel. Life, as you've learned, has a way of changing us, often in ways we least expect. But you will find a way to move forward. And perhaps, in time, the village will, too." Outside, the shadows of the evening were stretching longer, and a slight chill was creeping in with the dusk. The soft hum of a distant train signaled the end of another day. Miss Marple felt the weight of the world around her. Yet despite the discomfort of the revelations, she knew she had done what was right. The door creaked open, and Reverend Thomas entered the room, his expression solemn but warm. "I didn't want to leave without saying thank you, Miss Marple. You've done more than just solve a case. You've uncovered the truth that so many of us didn't know we were blind to." Miss Marple gave a soft nod. "It was my pleasure, Reverend. The truth always has a way of finding its way to the surface, even if it takes time." The Reverend lowered his gaze. "I only wish we had seen it sooner. The pain and suffering caused by Father Gabriel's actions were far more widespread than I realized. The villagers will need time to heal, but at least now they have the truth." Miss Marple agreed, though her mind was already on the next steps. "Yes. Healing takes time, and the scars may never fully fade. But the truth has set them on a path toward understanding, even if it's a difficult road." As the conversation shifted toward other matters, Daniel rose to leave, promising to visit Miss Marple again soon. Reverend Thomas, too, bade her farewell, leaving her alone in the quiet of her room. The sun was setting, casting long, fading rays across the small village of Little Hampton. Though the case was over, Miss Marple knew that the darkness lurking beneath polite facades would always be there, just waiting for someone to uncover it. Her mind drifted back to her home in St. Mary Mead. Peace awaited her there, a familiar comfort. Yet even there, she knew that new mysteries would eventually beckon, just as they always did. And when they did, Miss Marple would be ready. As the train slowly pulled away from the station the next morning, Miss Marple's thoughts were clear. Justice had been served, but it had not come without a cost. Yet, she found comfort in the simple truths she held dear, truths that no amount of manipulation or deceit could ever alter. In the end, the light of truth would always shine through. And as the train carried her away from Little Hampton, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, quiet smile. Another case solved, another mystery unraveled. But more importantly, another lesson learned: darkness may always be lurking, but so too will there always be those who fight for the light.